Hi. So I want to talk a little bit about John Stuart Mill now, and that fourth chapter of on liberty, which is his discussion of what the relationship should be between the obligations of society and individual liberty. And to figure this out, I think we need to rehearse a little bit of what Mill is trying to do in the context he's working in. I mean, remember, he's working in England of the mid 19th century, and he is working in a situation where quite a few of the liberties that he would want to argue for are already in place. I mean, he is not the first one to argue for this. So we can look back to Locke, certainly Hobbes, a number of these others, who have all argued that there is a very important part to be played by individual liberty. And so, for example, things like freedom of the press is pretty much in place. I mean, it's violated on occasion, of course, but as a value in society, I think it's pretty much accepted as something that ought to be there. And so there are a number of those kinds of things that Mill doesn't even really feel like he needs to argue for by the point that he's writing. So what he's interested in is really a vision of society that runs at odds both with Comte and what we're going to see with Marx in a few minutes as well. I mean, for Mill, unlike Comte, I mean, Comte, in a certain sense, wants to have an authoritative structure in society that guides us and tells us which way we should go, and that's science. Um, Marx, of course, is going to want to have some other kinds of emergent sorts of notions which allow us to understand the direction that society should go. Um, in both those cases, there is a presumption of our ignorance, that is, at least a potential ignorance on our part. In other words, no particular individual knows everything, and therefore, in Comte's case, we need science to guide us. In Marx's case, we need something in which we can come to understand the limits of our own reason and how much our reason is rooted within the kind of social structures in which we find ourselves, the modes of production, as it were. With Mill, there is also a sense that no individual knows everything, but it plays out very differently. I mean, for Mill, he's the classic liberal, and I don't mean liberal in the modern sense, of course. I mean liberal in the classical sense. The notion of individualism is important, and it's important precisely because as we exert our individual will, that is the thing that organizes society, not some deliberate action on our on anyone's part, but all of us exerting our individual wills will bring the best and brightest ideas to the surface. They will be debated, and the best ones will rise to the top and be instituted. That's kind of the classic Adam Smith Mill version of how individuality is a kind of self-organizing system. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, certainly in quite a few cases we can see that actually operates. Of course, in some cases we can see that it's a problematic sort of assumption to make. There are lots of ways you can game that system. But for Mill, he's really interested. I mean, he's operating, even though people have taken this notion of individualism seriously, he's operating at the early stages of the arguments for it. And if you look at his argument, there's really one major argument that he makes for the notion that we should allow individuals to exert their will to the fullest possible extent. And that, his principle is what we've come to know as the harm principle. In other words, we ought to allow individuals to do whatever they want unless they are harming somebody else. Okay, and Mill thinks that this is not a notion of relativism on his part or something like that. He thinks that that's the way that the best ideas are going to come to the surface. He does recognize that there are certain cases in which we want to have a government or a police force or whatever step in. Obviously, when harm is being done to somebody else, we need to have some way of regulating and punishing those who would do that. Short of that, though, we ought to be able to engage in whatever virtues or vices that we want to, up to the point that somebody else is being harmed. And furthermore, we should not be blamed for engaging in those vices even when somebody else is harmed. We should be blamed for the consequences of them, but not for engaging in the vices themselves. So, there's this very kind of radical notion of individual freedom in all of this. And it should be said that, On Liberty for Mill was as much his wife's the product of his wife's work as it was of his, and he admits that in his autobiography. Harriet Taylor does not really get the credit. I mean, everyone knows that she was, engaged on these concepts with him, but even he makes very clear that, especially in On Liberty, that it is as much hers as his, and in fact, he argued at one point that it ought to be co-authored, a co-authored book. So interesting thing about Harriet Taylor is that she is a person who is in some ways even more radical than Mill is. She really thinks that there needs to be absolutely no restraints on the exercise of individual will. Now, if we think about it for a second from our vantage point, that sounds like classic, neoconservatism in a certain sense. That sounds like the kind of rhetoric you might get out of the kind of right wing in the United States today. But if you think about it for a second, in the 19th century context, those were exactly the people who were arguing for things against things like slavery, for women's rights, against the torture and what they called vivisection of animals. They were arguing, in short, for all of the important social ideas of the day. In other words, they were not arguing on the basis solely of imagining a kind of business model where somebody's going to get rich or something like that. No, they were actually concerned about a society that functioned well and where people were being treated fairly. It's interesting, and in fact, there were those still that were arguing for slavery and things like that, and those were the humanists. I mean, those were people like Carlyle, who were arguing from a humanistic point of view that we are fundamentally unequal and fundamentally different. And it took like somebody like Mill, who believed that we are just, we should be understood not internally, but in terms of the actions that we put out there, and that if we do different things, the reason for that is that we have different opportunities and constraints that come upon us, right? So, in other words, you and I choose something different. Well, is that because you and I are different on the inside? Mill would say, no, it's not. It's because we have different opportunities, we have different ways of thinking about the world, and we have different kind of obligations or constraints that come upon us. If we had exactly the same things, weighing in on us, we would choose the same way. Right? So in other words, he's imagining a society in which there are differences among the kind of social interrelations we have, not differences in terms of our internal constitution or internal, kind of something fundamental to who we are. So think about this for a second in terms of the questions that we're working with in this course. I mean, ethics, epistemology, social philosophy. In a certain sense, Mill is somebody who is giving us a kind of metaphysic. I mean, there's a metaphysic assumed off the top, or at least a kind of negative metaphysic, almost the kind of thing that Comte might respect. In other words, there is a certain sense that we don't know who we are. We can only talk about how we choose, how we put ourselves out there in the world. And that choice is the thing that ought to have no boundaries to it, or no boundaries short of the harm principle. Okay, so in that sense, it's kind of not anti-metaphysical, but it's kind of a very modest metaphysics, I suppose. And so in that sense, Comte might like it. Now, it should be said that Mill actually argues against Comte, and specifically on the notion of positivism. He doesn't think that positivism is a particularly viable way to think about things, and he wrote about this. And so, we should not conflate Comte and Mill at all. And remember, Comte is the one who's going to say, ultimately, science is the thing that's going to guide us. And Mill is going to want to say, no, ultimately, people making individual decisions and then the social world working it all out, is the thing that's going to make for an equitable system. So, in other words, for Mill, in a certain sense, the epistemology, I mean, we could wonder exactly what his epistemology is. One might call it empiricist, I suppose. His ethics, in a certain sense, is a certain kind of assumption of how the ethical, how choices actually work. If there's no sense of thinking in terms of intentions, because that's an internal thing, remember, then we have to look somewhere else to think about, ethical virtue and vice. And where we're going to look? Well, we're going to look at the consequences of our actions, hence utilitarianism. But then that is all bound up with this notion that we ought not to fetter our choices. We ought to give our choices as much rein as possible so that the best ethical actions possible can be shown forth. And so there's a certain form of what sometimes I think of as moral imagination here. I mean, think about, under President George W. Bush in the early days after 9/11. There was a certain sense that he would say, if you're not for us, you're against us. If you're not with us, you're against us, right? And there was a certain very black and white sort of notion about, and you can understand to some extent, I suppose, at the time, there was a sense of needing to rally the nation together and all of those sorts of things. But it spoke to a kind of very limited sort of moral imagination, with us, against us, nothing in between. And when you're dealing with that kind of evil, it's understandable. But the fact is, most moral situations that we face are not like that. In most moral situations, what we're really thinking about is in terms of, people maximizing their values, maximizing their desires. And so in those situations, which are the vast majority of them, I think we might argue, we're looking at a situation in which moral imagination, having an imagination of how the kinds of actions we might engage in that fulfill everyone's desires would be superior to just a very cut and dried yes or no, good or evil, you're with us or you're against us sort of attitude. And so Mill I think of as somebody who is interested in that moral imagination, because I think in most cases he wants to see utility maximized for everyone. And so, if we're thinking about the issues on the borders of social philosophy and ethics, for Mill, they're really fairly coextensive with each other. You really can't have one without the other. And that takes on a different character, I think, than what we're going to see with someone like Comte, and certainly someone like Marx later on. So, that I think is something you can see in here. And so we have yet another approach, I suppose, to what's going on at the borders of those things, and certainly an approach that has a lot of currency to it today, I think. A lot of people, kind of put the best possible way. This is a kind of conservative version of social philosophy and ethics. Maybe not the kind you see played out in a lot of conservative discourse now, but given the best possible light, you would have something that looks like what Mill is arguing for. So on to Marx.